Welcome to Booktopia TV. I'm John Purcell, and I'm delighted to be here with Caroline Overington, best-selling novelist, Walkley winner, and now author of non-fiction titled The Last Woman Hanged.
Hello, John. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Can you tell me about, just to give us I want to talk about all the subjects that were in this book, but I just want a quick rundown on the book and why you chose the subject.
So Last Woman Hanged is about Louisa Collins, who was the first and the last woman hanged at the Darlinghurst jail. She was tried for the murder of one or the other of her husbands, not once but 4 times before they finally got a conviction, and she was hanged in the year 1889. At around about the same time, women in New South Wales were arguing for more human rights, in particular the right to vote and the right to sit on juries. And so it became a confluence of events. Women were campaigning both for Louisa and both for their own human rights.
And was it a case that it was convenient that this woman was being in court for murder at the time when they were asking for rights, and they used her as a subject, or was there something in that story which was actually they felt was anti-women?
Oh, well, it was the injustice of it. I mean, the case against Louisa was entirely circumstantial. It wasn't the case, for example, that she had stabbed somebody or shot somebody and was caught with blood on her hands. The case was, all of the evidence was circumstantial. They had trouble even linking her to the so-called murder weapon, which was the arsenic, and even that they weren't really sure that it was arsenic. And yet they put her on trial once. The jury failed to convict her, it wouldn't come close. The second jury did the same. Then they tried her a third time. And by then she'd been heard by 3 juries, 36 men, and they put her on trial again. So 4 juries, 48 men, in a court system that was comprised entirely of men. So all of the judges were men, the prosecutors were men, the lawyers were men, the Premier was a man, obviously the Governor was a man. Women had had no say at all in the way the case had unfolded. They had no say in the laws under which they lived. So it was a perfect example of taxation without representation. She was being tried by a system. The juries, for example, couldn't in any way be considered her peers. She was a poor, drunken mother of 10 from swampy Botany, and yet she was being tried by landowners, and the Crown had at its disposal the colony's best barristers. The barrister they gave her was the first in the colony to be struck off the roll for dishonesty. So the injustice of it energised women. The idea that you could pay with your life when there was so much doubt struck hundreds of people as unfair.
Why do they persist? Why were they persisting in this?
I've given it a lot of thought because it isn't written down anywhere why they kept going and kept going and kept going. But there had been, the poison that she was said to have used was called rough on rats. It came from the United States. It was essentially pure arsenic with a little bit of lamp coal to make it black so you wouldn't confuse it with sugar or salt in your house. And there had been a number of deaths in Australia from people who had taken it either unwittingly or had been fed it, or had taken it even as a way of committing suicide. And people had been writing to newspapers saying, why is this highly deadly poison suddenly arrived on our shelves and is being sold in these large boxes which are large enough to wipe out an entire township? And I think there were some men in particular who were concerned that if Louisa had poisoned her husband and had been allowed to get away with it, not been sent to the gallows, then it might have caused an epidemic of such deaths, because women at that time often lived terrible lives. They could not get out of their marriages. They were at the mercy of men who would drink heavily and then their fists would fly. If they did try to get a divorce, they would lose their children, and then, but legally, they would lose their children, and would then live lives of poverty. So there was no real way out of a bad situation in those days. And there was some concern, I think, that arsenic, for some of them, might have proved an easy out.
So instead of saying, okay, what's going on here? Should we become better men? Should we give people more equality? No, we won't do that. That'd be too hard. We'll just get rid of the way in which women can kill us. Is that like
Right, because women have always, this has been true for more than 125 years. It's been 125 years since Louisa died. Women have always used cleverness in an effort to dispatch their partner. So when you look at violence against women, it's almost always guns, knives, fists. But women have tended to use, they think about it for longer, because in the battle with men, women are at a disadvantage. because of size. So there are women who are reluctant to get into a fight with a man and reluctant to take a knife or a gun to a fight with a man. And poison has been a traditional way of getting yourself out of a marriage.
That's for the whole of human history, isn't it?
For all of human history, that's absolutely right. You're 100% right. This has been the way out because it levels the playing field between men and women in violent relationships. So there was that concern. But I have to be honest with you, the zeal, the fervour with which they went after her startled me. If it had been a really clear-cut case, this was an evil woman that they needed to dispatch, because there was a feeling at the turn of the century still that there were some people who had evil within them, and the only way to deal with that was to force a confession, to get a confession, get them to confess to the Almighty and send them to meet the Maker, who would offer them forgiveness. That was an idea that was widely accepted. And the idea that you might be hanged for your crime, men were encouraged to see that as a good thing, because they would be able to repent and live for all eternity. They went for Louisa with a passion that you don't often see in criminal law.
The women's movement at the time, why did they pick up on Louisa? Is it because they then highlight the fact that women at the time didn't have the vote, don't have representation, that they weren't doing that they had no jury to convict them, then the group of peers that would be there? Is it that they chose, or is it something else?
So at the time, the Premier, also called the Prime Minister at the time, because this was before Australia had federated, was Sir Henry Parkes. And he stood up in Parliament and quite audaciously said, the women of Australia would vote to see her hanged. Well, that was an audacious thing to say, because the women of Australia couldn't vote on anything. Yeah. And so there was this idea that how can we be rushing towards federation? We were less than 10 years away at the time. How can we be rushing towards federation and yet still be insisting that half the population doesn't have equal rights? And that's without even considering the position of Indigenous Australians, who would have to wait a whole lot longer before they would be able to vote or sit on a jury. And although part of the argument was, well, at the very least there should be women on the jury, women didn't sit on juries in New South Wales until 1947, and even then only in the city courts where there was more than one bathroom, because the idea that women might share the same toilets as men was so outrageous. So when you think about how far we've come a long way and in an incredibly short period of time.
So it really was the plumbers' fault.
I don't think that you couldn't, like, for example, in the book, Louisa knows that her husband is dying because he's been sick for a very long time and he's not recovering, and his condition is getting worse. She's been several times to get the doctor to see to him, and she's pleading for him to give her medicines and so on. And at some point she realises he's about to die, and so she needs him to sign a will, because otherwise she's going to be left destitute. So she has to run around the neighbourhood looking for a man to witness the will, because the signature of any woman, and there were dozens of them in the house helping her tend to him and look after the children while her husband was sick, the signatures of none of them would have held water in those days.
So I can see a career coming out of this, of resurrecting these wonderful people so that we all know about them.
And isn't it funny that we're at the moment, because the Stella Prize last year went to a friend of mine, Claire Wright, who wrote the Eureka story, went back and wrote the Eureka story by putting all the women back in, because that story had been told so many times, but the role of women had been completely erased. Like, there were women on the goldfields, they ran businesses, they were really successful, they had families there, and yet they had disappeared from history. I feel really confident at the moment that there is a movement to hear women's stories, to remind readers that women have existed in this country and had a really important role to play.
It's been lovely talking to you,
Oh,
Caroline.
it's so good to see you again.
Caroline's new book, Last Woman Hanged, is available from booktopia.com.au right now.